Chicago, and hello to everyone who's joining us for our keynote. Our next keynote is a former student of mine's mother. Her name is Bonnie Koenig, and I will introduce her in a moment. But I would love for you to say hello in the chat. Tell us who you are, where you're from, what time of day it is, that sort of thing. And we'll have everybody get settled in for our next talk. I see that Peggy George is checking in from Arizona. It's always great to see you, Peggy. Anyone else out there in comment land? Okay, hopefully people are coming in from the last set of sessions and we'll enjoy a nice leisurely keynote talk before we have our expo sessions. And we have someone from Tacoma, Washington. So it's the middle of the day there. And Carrie in Vermont, school is out. And Jennifer Klein, who just did a marathon workshop. And Cheryl from Maine. And I was thinking of Burlington, Vermont earlier today, Bonnie, because we were watching something. Oh, what was it? Where at University of Vermont, the ratio of women to men is off. And so they're calling it Girlington. and they're doing some DEI work around how do you support men. It was on CBS Sunday This Morning, on yesterday. So I was thinking of Vermont today and that. We also have Ann Arbor represented. Lots of Mainers coming in. Thank you. In Canada, Rita, and we have Washington, D.C. That's great. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Let me read Bonnie's bio, and then I'm going to turn it over to her and have her share her incredible expertise with us today. Bonnie Koenig is a consultant working with organizations on their governance, management, and strategic planning with a focus on international engagement. She is a former executive director of Zonta International, a worldwide women's service organization, and the Council of Great Lakes Governors. She has an MA in International Relations from Yale University. She has lived and worked in Australia, China, France, India, Mauritania, West Africa, and has traveled to over 50 countries. So, Bonnie, we're so happy to have you here and can't wait to learn from you during this session. Thank you for coming today.
Thanks, Lucy, and hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be with you today. It looks like we're spanning the United States right now, and somebody from Costa Rica and somebody from Romania. So hopefully we will be a global audience, but I'm really glad to see you all here. I have a few slides that I'm going to share that if you've been on other sessions that you've seen, but we're going to do those first, and then we'll get into what I'd like to share with you today. So as you all know, the sessions are going to be recorded. Lucy, do I need to do anything on that, or you do that on your end?
You're good. It's recording right now.
Okay. Thanks. I probably should have asked about that. So thanks, everyone. We also want to obviously thank our sponsors for this event. I also want to give a big shout out to Lucy Gray. For those of you who don't know her personally, she's just amazing in terms of these kinds of events. I had the opportunity, the good fortune to also be a speaker for one of the original global education conferences quite a number of years ago. And I use these conferences as a model for what good virtual conferences can be. So a big shout out to Lucy for really modeling some wonderful global interactions. For those of you who are doing social media, this is the hashtag we're using, as you probably know. So anything that you want to share from this session or anything else, that's GLOW.edu. I've been using a bit of what used to be Twitter, and we can talk a little bit about that in a few minutes as well as LinkedIn. Everyone I see has been sharing their locations, but if you've just come in, please do share your location so we have a sense of how global we are and where people are coming from. It's getting a little bit late in the date in some places, but people from Asia are starting to come online. So it's always interesting to see how that happens. I've called this the art of international engagement, and I'm going to talk a little bit in a few minutes about why I called it the art of international engagement. And here's the outline for this session. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, to give you some of my perspectives on this particular topic. And then I'd like to be able to have a bit of a dialogue going as much as we can through the chat with your questions. So anytime that you might have a question or a comment, please put it in the chat, and I will, when we get to that part, I will go back and look at them. And I know Lucy's been helping to monitor those as well, so that'll be great. But please do, any thoughts that you have, share those. So the first thing that I'm going to be talking about, just to go over the agenda, the outline for this session, is how engaging internationally can be seen as an art as opposed to a science, and I'll talk a little bit about that. As you all well know, we are living in a very changing international environment in many different ways. There are a few aspects of the environment that I would particularly like to talk about. Veronica led us on a great session a little bit earlier today on global competencies, so I'm not going to repeat what she said, other than I did really like her 4 stages, and I'm going to talk about those. And I'd like to share some of my own particular perspectives on global competencies, and especially from a practitioner's perspective, and getting very practical about how we develop our own global competencies. And then last but not least, I want to talk about cross-border collaborations and partnerships, because I think you as educators and the kind of networks you have, many of you are already doing those, but there's a great opportunity for doing more of those. And so that's going to be the 4th area that I'm going to talk about. So let's start with the art of international engagement, and why I'm calling it an art. So often with these kinds of topics, people think, okay, I need a how-to manual, or I need a checklist. There's various things that I need to do. And the reality is, when you're engaging internationally, as those of you who have done this, or continuing to do this, expanding your own skills, is that there's some things that you can learn, and there's certainly some things that people can suggest to you. There's certainly themes, there's certainly good practices. But the reality is, a lot of it is intuition. A lot of it is about the way that you yourself are dealing with what you've learned. And so that's part of why I really want to focus on it as an art. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. A number of years ago, I worked with an international group of jazz educators. And one of the things that people who do jazz music, as those of you who either like jazz music or do jazz music yourself may know, is that they do a lot of improvising. So they have a score, and they generally follow that score, but they improvise as they go. And I like that as a good example of what we're talking about. So you have to have some parameters, or it's good to have some parameters, but there's a lot of flexibility on the way. So that's why I'm calling this the art of international engagement. And there's a few areas that I'd like to talk about to help illustrate that. The first one is a mindset. Engaging effectively internationally really is about having a global mindset. And many of you have that, or you're developing that, and that's part of why you're at this conference, and that's great. It's a way of being in the world. And part of it is being a continuous learner. No matter what age we are, we can always be learning, and learning other people's perspectives. So that mindset, again, that's going to be a bit of an art in terms of how you bring things in, how you're curious about the world, absolutely, and how you interact with the world. A second reason why, in some ways, international engagement is an art is it's a two-way process, and that we often think about communication. This is sort of a good example, right? I'm sitting here and I'm talking to you as educators, as trainers, as leaders. We often are trying to get a message across, and we don't spend quite as much time thinking about what kind of information we're getting back, how people are responding to that, and how we loop that, how that communication, which has to be 2 ways, and that interaction, then each of us are going to hopefully think about that conversation we had, think about that interaction we had, and we're going to put it into practice, and we're going to learn. So there are loops in terms of the learning process. And it's incredibly important, obviously, in terms of international engagement, because you need to do a lot of listening and learning, as most of you know, and we'll talk a little bit more about. So again, it's another reason why it's an art, not a science, because you're constantly learning and processing. A third aspect that I want to talk about is listening and observing. Many of us as teachers, as educators, as trainers, as practitioners, as leaders in different ways, we have been trained to put ourselves forward. to see ourselves in some ways as experts, which is not a word that I use a whole lot these days, because everybody has lived experiences, and sometimes we give experts a little bit too much focus. And again, it's the communication out as opposed to the listening in. But listening and observing is incredibly important part of international engagement. A lot of communication and a lot of messages that people send, of course, are nonverbal, and that's the observing part. So I want to tell you a little bit about a game I play, and it's something that you may want to think about some variation about on it as well. So when my children were younger and we were doing some traveling with them, we were very fortunate because I'm not an academic, but my husband is, and he had real sabbaticals, and I was able to make transitions to be able to spend time overseas. And so we would take our children, and one of the things that we wanted to train them in was listening and observing. So we played this game. If we were sitting in the park or we were somewhere outside our own environment, we'd say to them, how do you know you're not in the US? How do you know that you're not at home? And at first, you answer in the very easy ways. Well, the language is different, the signs are different. But then they got better, because you're looking for the kinds of things. Are women sitting by themselves? Is there a gender distinction? Do we see families? What kinds of groups of people do we see? There are all kinds of things that you start to observe. So it's a game that I even play by myself now, even when I'm not in a teaching or training mode. And it's something that it may be useful to you as well. But it's really important in terms of learning and realizing that listening is really important, and training ourselves to be more listeners, and observing as well, because often it is a lot of nonverbal communication. Another aspect of this being an art, and that I wanted to touch upon, is adaptability and flexibility. One of the things that's most important with international engagement is that kind of adaptability and flexibility, because inevitably, when you start to interact with somebody from a different culture, you're going to be forced to look at things in a different way. It'd be great, obviously, if it's something that you could just do naturally, and begin to think about that. But once you start to interact, you're going to have to change the way that you do things. And that adaptability and flexibility is incredibly important. I've been doing a fair amount of mentoring of young people going into the work world, into the global arena, either having graduated from college or in some cases even having their master's. And one of the questions they ask about is, what kinds of things would I hire for? Well, I don't hire right now. I had been an executive director and was hiring. But when I hired, I looked a lot for adaptability and flexibility. If you have that skill and that ability to adapt and be flexible, it's amazing what you can do in terms of international engagements and cross in multinational collaborations and going out in the world. So that's really something that I feel is incredibly important as well. Part of this I want to talk a little bit about is core vis-a-vis customization. And this comes back to the point that I made earlier about the sort of the checklist, and how I think we need to move away from checklists or how-tos. When you're trying to help people to move more into a global mindset or more into doing effective international engagement, there's often the sense that, again, we have to sort of go through this list, and these are the kinds of things that I'm passing on to you, and these are the kinds of things that everybody needs to do. In a educational situation, there's a certain amount of core curriculum that everybody needs to know. And an organizational perspective, especially, for instance, if you're an international organization and you may have chapters or efforts in different parts of the world, again, there's a certain vision, there's certain things that everybody has to do the same. But there tends to be a sense that more needs to be core than the reality. And so when you're thinking about developing a program that has an international aspect, or if you are in an organization, or if you're doing a training, working with your students, whatever your own environment is, think about, you could almost make a list of sort of, this needs to be core and this needs to be customized, and play with what that balance is and see how much you can actually move from the core side to the customization side. And I think you might be surprised at how much you can move towards the customization side. So it's, again, a really important concept to think about. And then I want to talk just a little bit about relationships, again, from the perspective of the art of international engagement. And I'll come back to this more when I talk about cross-border collaboration. But one of the things about relationships in a global world is assessing expectations. If you think about any relationship you're in, whether or not it's a personal relationship or a professional relationship, there's a certain amount of adaptation that has to happen for that relationship to be successful. And part of that is based on expectations. It's based on your understanding what the expectations are of the person that you're in the relationship with. And that's a challenging thing to do from a multicultural perspective. And that you can't manage those expectations and you can't strengthen those that relationship if you don't have a sense from your partner, your potential partner, what those expectations is. And from a cross-cultural perspective, it's often hard to read what somebody else is telling you. And so that's something that's really important to keep in mind as well. And I'll go into it a little bit more in terms of trying to assess that. But it's another way in which, again, it's a balancing of an art. So somebody can give you a list like this, and somebody can give you a sense of the kinds of things that are effective about international engagement. But it all comes down to, once you have that sense, how do you then go out in the world and use them? And anytime you have a question or comment, please do put it in the chat. And thanks for doing that. I'm not going to look at those right now when we come to the Q&A part of that, so that you haven't lost a question or an idea. We can come back to that then. So thanks for doing that. As I mentioned, I do want to talk a little bit about the changing international environment. None of this is going to be a surprise to you, but I do want to focus on particular aspects of this and some of what my perspective has been. So clearly demographics are changing. We know that diversity is increasing for those of you within the US. We know that diversity is increasing for other countries around the world where refugee populations are growing, or for other reasons, people are coming from other parts of the world. Diversity is increasing. We also know that people under the age of 25 around the world is increasing dramatically. So these are statistics that you've all seen and that you all know. One of the things that's coming with this is increased expectations, especially among younger generations that we're seeing. For those of us who are a little bit older, when we came into the work world, there was an expectation that there were certain things that we were just going to do. There were parameters, and we sort of needed to pay our dues or learn the ropes. That's not necessarily something that is common among young people who are entering the work world. For my sector, doing a lot of work with non-governmental organizations, the number of non-governmental organizations that have been started in the last few years rivals the periods of the 1970s and 1990s, where we saw a tremendous amount of new NGOs. And part of the reason why this is happening is because young people are saying the ones that are out there just aren't working well. And so they have this expectation that they don't want to continue with this slow pace. And in many ways, they're right. You know, there's incredible challenges in terms of, obviously, in terms of peace and conflicts, but there's incredible challenges in terms of climate change. Again, I don't need to list them for all you, but they're impatient. But for those of us in the older generation and those of us who are teachers and trainers, there's an incredible opportunity for multi-generational interactions. I commented about in the session, for those of you who heard the earlier keynote with Veronica, about the young woman in the video. There's an awful lot to be learned from the younger generation. And I think most of you who are teachers realize that there's a lot of multi-generational interactions and learning that we can do, but we're not trained that way. And I will come to that in just a moment in terms of cultural paradigms and shifts that we all need to make in terms of our own behaviors. Then the third item that I just want to talk about is power shift initiatives. Some of you may know that term, power shift. It's used a lot in the global arena right now. From a domestic perspective in the US or many other countries, it's coming from a diversity perspective. So as the population may become more diverse, may become younger, in many cases, the power structure of having a particular group that had more of the ability to make decisions, there's pressure to shift that to make it more equitable. We're seeing that on the world stage as well. And there's actually a hashtag for those of you who are interested, hashtag shift the power. And it's a very dynamic global movement right now. I was actually on a call earlier today with a global group that's working towards a conference in Bogota, Colombia, in the early part of December. And it's basically looking at these power structures and the the structures that exist from a philanthropic perspective, from an aid perspective, where money traditionally has come from the global north and these power centers to people in the global south, or the majority world. The terminology is changing. And in many cases, the decisions aren't being made by the people who are affected, and very rarely is that sustainable. So there's a lot of conversations around how this can change, and it's something that you may just want to be aware of, that it's happening around the world in lots of different ways. I then said that I would talk about global competencies. Part of what I wanted to talk about, I mentioned the fact that for those of you who are able to listen, Peggy did a wonderful, Veronica did, Peggy, I saw your name there, so I was thinking Peggy. Veronica did a wonderful presentation earlier today about global competencies, and went into quite a bit of depth, and there's obviously a lot of tremendous learning there. I liked her 4 stages. I liked her stages of examine, explore, then understand, then engage, and then to take action. And what I love about that is that examine is the learning part of this. Understanding is something that I find that's incredibly important, and we don't really do well. Again, we're trained in systems that have us listening to respond, not necessarily to understand. And I love that expression, that we should listen to that phrase, that we should listen to understand and not to respond, because we're really trained to do the opposite. So understanding, I think, is really important before we engage. And then obviously engaging. And then the 4th part of it, taking action. Ultimately, everything we do is about making a better world, or should be about making a better world. And unfortunately, we often get stopped along different stages of that process. So, we learn sometimes for learning's sake, which is wonderful, but ultimately it would be great if we take action in whatever area that you're particularly concerned about. In the Sustainable Development Goals, I know are a big theme for many of us, but in whatever area that you particularly want to take action. So I'm not going to obviously repeat other than that framework, which I really liked. I'm not going to repeat a lot of what was talked about earlier, but there are a few aspects from my particular experience that I do want to share. And what I alluded to is the structures we are in. So if you think about the way that most of us come into the work world, how we're taught, and the structures that we practice in, they are very traditional. They are very Western or global North. However you want to call it, no matter where you happen to be in the world, if you're interacting with an international environment, those are the structures we're in. They're very power oriented, and we need to change those paradigms. And part of changing those paradigms is changing ourselves first. And that's, to me, what a lot of global competencies is about, is how we change ourselves so we can help to change our structures, so we can help to have a different impact. Self-assessment is really hard to do, and most of us talk about doing it more than we do it, and it's because it's a practice. So I want to just focus on encouraging you all to have your own approach to this. If you think about your own approach towards a global mindset, international engagement, whatever phrase we want to use, having ease with different cultures, how often do you go into a listening or learning mode? Maybe just think about the past, week or so, not necessarily on a conference like this where we're all in a listening mode to a certain extent, but think about, in the classroom or in your organization or whatever else you're doing as a leader, how often are you really in a very deep listening and learning mode? Listening, perhaps, if you're a teacher, to your students, but learning. Are you learning from them? And how often are you doing that, as opposed to thinking about what am I going to say next? How do I respond? Do you know your own blind spots? And where can you improve? What do you need to learn? I've discovered for myself that my style in facilitation, especially, is very Western. I'm very focused on time, on making sure we get from one agenda item to another. And it's something that I found that it's not always necessarily the best. And when I've worked with facilitators who are from other parts of the world, where perhaps there's more of an oral tradition, there's more focus on empathy, often there are times where you want to let the conversation go, that there's a real advantage not to necessarily staying with the time, and often you can make it up afterwards. So it's one of the things that I've realized that I had to learn. And one of the ways that I tried to do that is by working with partners that I can learn from. So I would really encourage you to think about that and to think about your own strategies for practicing. So I want to talk a little bit about strategies for practicing from a personal perspective and from groups and organizations. So if from a personal perspective, this is something, and many of you may already have this practice, and that's great. But if you don't, or if you want to improve upon it, you may want to think a little bit about what you need to learn yourself and what you want to practice, and then decide within your own ways of learning how to do that. I find with myself, for example, the game I told you about earlier in terms of being in different situations, you could practice something like that even in a conference like this, in terms of if you're listening to people from different parts of the world and you're looking at questions and thinking about what's going on that perhaps is a little bit different than you thought. How is somebody reacting to something differently than you are? So you could just take 5 minutes every day just to think about how you want to practice that kind of whatever kind of change that you want to make in your own approaches, and come up with some kind of strategy for yourself. How are you going to make sure that you do it? So that's from a personal perspective. From an organizational perspective, it's equally important for the organization to recognize where it needs to be better, for the leadership to recognize where it needs to be better. And often that can be, if you are working with a group, perhaps there's some key questions that the group can have in front of them and focus on together. Do you model for your students and for your peers a global mindset? Do you encourage people to speak up if they don't understand something, or if they are looking at something in a different way? Are there champions within your groups and within leadership positions who can do sort of this kind of peer-to-peer encouragement? Sometimes it just takes each other reminding each other, having mutual accountability that this is what we're going to do. So I'd really encourage you to think about strategies for yourself individually as well as for whatever groups you're in. And I want to share just a couple of examples. I'm working with an Australian group they're Australian based. They work in quite a number of different countries, and they have some what they call international entities that are starting to develop some more autonomy and make some more independent decisions. And so they're moving in this direction. They very much want to do that, but they're a completely Australian board right now. So they need to take two steps. One, they need to diversify their board, but they also need to individually and collectively think more globally as opposed to parochially. And that's hard to do, to think more globally as opposed to parochial. So we've put together some key questions and ways that they can do that collectively. But I think that as we've gone through this process, I think that they've all really worked together on this, or are working together on this. It's a multi-year process. And then there's another organization that I'm working with. It's actually a network. It's an umbrella organization in the global health space. And their steering group is very global, and they think of themselves as being very global, but they have one major US funder who drives a lot of their decision making and a lot of the way they approach things. And they don't always realize what they're doing. They don't necessarily practice what they preach. They can be very exclusive. And so again, we're working with those people that are the champions that really do understand this, to try to get people to continuously monitor their own behaviors and monitor the organization's behaviors. And then I wanted to talk about cross-border collaborations. What I often do with questions like this before one goes into a collaboration is to think about, in this case, it's the W's. For those of you who have ever taken a journalism course, they always talk about the whys, the what, the who's. And it's really important initially before you go into a collaboration, and this is part about managing expectations, is the why. Why are you doing some kind of cross-border collaboration? What is it that you want to do? And that's really important to know what your own expectations are and what you're trying to accomplish before you get into the who. So I would really encourage you to think about some of these basic questions before you go into cross-border collaborations, whatever they might be. And then obviously outreach is really important initially. Who could those potential partners be? Conferences like this are great. You all probably do some of this, and I know that Lucy's encouraged you to do this. Take advantage of the networking. If there are people who you think might be a potential partner, reach out to them. Social media is good for that, depending on what platform you're on. In the old days of Twitter, there was a lot of good interaction that way. LinkedIn is becoming, I think, a little bit more robust in terms of people interacting with each other, but there's often an approach that most people are comfortable with, where if you have something in common, you send them a direct message or reach out an email or whatever, and then often it might lead you to a video call, and then eventually to perhaps thinking about what you might do together. I don't think I've been on any virtual conference like this in the past few years through the pandemic where some kind of potential relationship or potential partnership hasn't resulted. So that's a great way to begin to do this. And then you think about establishing a relationship. As I mentioned earlier, relationships take a lot of nurturing. So think of it as these phases. And if you've got some ideas in terms of how you want to collaborate and you think you want to establish a relationship, what are the guidelines for that relationship? Again, what are the expectations and what would everyone like to have accomplished for that? And then I'm a big fan of piloting. So much of this work is multi-year. It doesn't happen very quickly. And often we'll go into something thinking that we have a sense of how it's going to work. And either we have to change it or it doesn't work. And that's okay. There's, as people and educators, that there's an awful lot that can be learned from failure. And so setting it up as a pilot, it allows you to say, okay, this is something we're going to learn from, and it may work and it may not work. So think about if you have an initial collaboration going into a pilot, and sometimes having a few different pilots at the same time allow you to find what works and sometimes even bring some of them together. And then, as I mentioned, it takes a lot of nurturing. This is multi-year work, and often people will come in and out of their positions, and you need to have a way for people can exit and other people can come back in. And it's really important to do that. And I want to share a few examples around this as well. So a number of years ago, I started to work with the American Academy of Pediatrics. They had a particular program that helped to avoid birth asphyxiation, babies suffering, babies dying in the first moment of their life. And just by pediatricians traveling around the world, they discovered that it was being used in quite a number of countries because it worked the way that they are training midwives and nurses and others to work in terms of avoiding the birth asphyxiation, worked in very low resource environments. So it was cut up in quite a number of different places, but it was an American curriculum and it was being done in a very structured way. So they were interested in how that project could potentially, or how this curriculum could potentially be used in other places. And so we started to work on identifying partners. And what they found were there was a corporation that was manufacturing mannequins who was willing to donate and then sell some of these mannequins for training at a very low rate, at a discounted rate. And then they found that there were different organizations around the world that were working in health environments that they could work with. And so it took quite a while, but after establishing these relationships and piloting the collaboration, they created something called Helping Babies Breathe, which is now Helping Babies Thrive. Redid the curriculum, so it was a global curriculum, established these partnerships, and it's now being used in over 100 different countries. It may be more at this point, but it's integrated into the local health programs, and it's much more sustainable. A second project I want to talk about is one that I initiated a few years ago called Civil Society and Testing Change. And I was taking a look at all of the changes, as many of us were, in terms of the external environment that I talked about. And many non-governmental organizations were really struggling with how to stay relevant. I mentioned the fact that a lot of them were being replaced. But we have a lot of money that's invested around the world in these NGOs, and some of them probably should go out of business. But others of them just really needed to reorient the way that they were working. A lot of conversation about this, but not a whole lot of action. I started to talk to a lot of colleagues around the world, and we saw it as a puzzle. And what were the missing pieces that we could look at? And so one of the missing pieces was this testing, this multi-year testing. So we started this project that focused on pilots. It focused on how do you better integrate youth into non-governmental organizations? How do you do better impact assessment? What I call the so what question. are you making a difference? How do leadership approaches need to change? And so we developed a series of working groups that would work together with a lead organization. It would be vested in the organization that would test over the years. It ran for about 10 years, and we're just about at the point where we're going to be winding it down, because a lot of these projects are not designed to go on forever. It makes a lot of sense to do some piloting and creating connections among different peoples, among different organizations. And then when the time is run, for the momentum to then evolve it to something else. So we're working on winding it down and how we can save that knowledge. So that's a little bit in terms of some thoughts about cross-border collaboration. Putting it into action, I've talked, because I'm a practitioner and a very action-oriented person, I've talked a lot about this, but I just want to highlight at this point, hopefully you've been thinking about this as well. What might you do in terms of more listening and observing? What might you do in terms of more outreach? What might you do in terms of strategies around better global competencies for yourself and for the groups that you work in? All the kinds of things that we talked about, hopefully you've been thinking about some practical action, and maybe we can even share some tips in the Q&A part. I wanted to share just a few resources. I think Lucy shared, or will share at some point, my website. I curate resources that are primarily focused on NGOs, nonprofit organizations, but they're useful in terms of any kind of educational approach. So thank you, Lucy. There's the website and /resources, or you can go and at the top bar, you'll see resources. You may want to take a look at those. One of the things that I find is really important to a global mindset is recognizing the fact that there are different time zones around the world, and that there are different languages around the world. Clearly, when we come to a session like this, where it's been focused on, and we see that, but it's not necessarily something people think about. If you do schedule meetings with colleagues from different parts of the world, I find timeanddate.com, some of you may know this, is an invaluable resource. They also, you can put in your different time zones, and if they'll tell you it's a green, yellow, red system. Green is a good time of day in terms of business for everybody. Yellow if people should be up, but it may not be their business hours, and then red if somebody has to be in the middle of the night. And it gives you a way of planning those meetings. And it also adjusts for daylight savings time in different parts of the world that change all the time and really confuse us. So a few other websites here in terms of different cross-cultural communication. That article can also be found in my resources. Actually, most of these have been pulled from that resource section, but I just wanted to highlight a few. And then my book on nonprofits may be of interest to you as well. And then before we go into Q&A, I just wanted to share some contact information. That's my email. If you wanted to follow up on something, feel free to do that. The website, which has been shared at the moment, I'm on Twitter. As you all know, it's changing dramatically, but it's still a fairly well-used global resource, at least right now. So I'm still on it. And then LinkedIn. Alrighty, we still have at least about 10 minutes or so for questions and answer, and perhaps a little bit more. So Lucy, have you picked up some of those? Okay, great. We have some questions to start with. Do you know places where we can match funding and support to make it sustainable? Funding is an incredible challenge, obviously. And I'm not a fundraiser, and I'm not somebody who's particularly good at this in terms of funding. But if you start to go out and the best thing I can actually recommend is just to Google it. Start to look for people who are doing the kind of work that you're doing and who's funding them. And that's often a good way to then find potential funders who are in your particular area. So that's the best advice that I can give as a non-fundraiser, just to begin to look at funders who are funding the kinds of projects that you're interested in having funding, and go from there. Did we have other questions or comments that we can highlight? Great, thank you. So I'm going to take just a minute to read this. Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. In terms of the facilitation styles, There are, for those of you who do facilitation in one way or another, and there are a lot of different styles, and a lot of the, again, traditional sort of how-tos come out of the very Western culture, and making space for other ways of approaching things are really important. For those of you who are facilitators, there's a group called the International Association of Facilitators, and there are a lot of sort of smaller networks. If you're interested in some of the sort of the global groups that have started around facilitation, send me an email and I can give you some more information. But it's really important to think about our own styles, and think about how we can learn to adopt our own approaches so that they do create space for those who may have different approaches. Do that after flexibility. Thanks, Amy, for pointing that out. And I want to give a special acknowledgement to people who are here right now who aren't English speakers, or native English speakers. Thank you for really bearing with us. And it's great to see that there's some Spanish translation and other ways that we're acknowledging the fact that we're not all equally comfortable with English. And yes, that concept of adaptability, flexibility, I think is a great one to be used in so many different ways. If you think about a lot of aspects of life, the more flexible we can be, the more that we can just expand our own options and be able to do things that perhaps that we couldn't do. We have a joke in our family that years ago, my sister suggested that we keep our standards low as long as we could, because once they would go up, they would never go down again. And we joke that we followed it in our family and she didn't necessarily follow it in hers. But one of the things about keeping yourself flexible is that you can do a lot of things. One of the things that we always try to do when we travel, and it's something that you can think about with your students and other groups as well, is to encourage people to really get to know people when they're traveling. And that the more that you can stay flexible, and the more that you can go into different environments that perhaps aren't your own environment, the more that you can learn. So there is this, I think, life learning around adaptability and flexibility, and the perspectives that one can then learn, and one can approach in a way that if you were less flexible, that you really couldn't, and your learning opportunities would be limited. So thanks for that, Amy.
I'm going to jump in here and add something. I'm going to, I think this question of funding, and Ray brought up this, that there's a course that she's taking that she's finding really useful, and it's talking about the finance. The other groups I'm thinking of, if you're in Europe, Erasmus Plus seems to fund a lot of global citizenship type of work. There is, here in the US, the Stevens Initiative, which is funding lots of virtual exchange programs. And I think they have a competition going on right now that maybe the applications are due soon. But this seems to be a hot topic amongst organizational leaders when I talk to them, like, where do we find the funding? Because in US education, there tends to be the priorities that are established by the funders, as opposed to, like the Gates Foundation or whatever. And I don't, and so maybe the trick is for people is to figure out where their initiatives fit into those hot topics.
Yeah.
And in terms of having a global perspective and that sort of thing, because it doesn't seem, everybody kind of wants to know here in the US that are small global organizations, how do we access funding? The other thing that's happened in the US too, there's been a lot of funding for COVID, for ESSER funding is what it's called. And that funding has to be spent by schools it can be used pretty loosely, is my understanding, in this last wave of it, by September of 2024. And what they're anticipating is that there's going to be a big financial cliff that everybody's going to fall off of. And so, because when September 2024 rolls around, because a lot of schools have funded people through that money, they may have to lay people off and that sort of thing, or keep people and deal with less resources. So there's a very strange, I don't know, in terms of the funding piece, I just don't know what to tell people. And I think that there are probably people out there who have a better idea of this. USAID is also another group that I'm thinking might have some, interest in this, or the US State Department sometimes funds different programs as well.
Yeah.
So
Thanks, Lucy.
it's tricky.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and thanks for jumping in on this. I have two things that I want to pick up from that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it is a challenging question, and if anybody has any additional resources around thoughts around funding to put them in the chat, that would be great, because it is something that we're all struggling with. I want to pick up on part of what Lucy said around hot topics and the SDGs. I think this idea of sort of riding the wave and hot topics is not necessarily what we would all think about doing, but it can be really useful, because often what you're doing can fit into a hot topic where a lot of funding is going to. And the Sustainable Development Goals are very much one of these areas. I wrote a blog post a number of years ago when the Sustainable Development Goals were originally hot, sort of moving towards 2015. And then you may remember that it sort of cooled down again, and then it got hot again. So you could go and take a look at that. But I very much think that sort of riding that wave and looking at hot topics and how you might be able to find funding from that is definitely a really good tip.
Yeah, and then there's another question about bringing students from overseas for a short time stay, and I don't know where to go with this one, but one way some organizations have infused global into schools, I'm thinking particularly of Participate, which is a North Carolina-based group that has organized or facilitated J1 visas for teachers to come to the U.S. to teach in hard-to-staff areas. So, for example, a teacher could come from South America and teach Spanish in a rural area where they need Spanish teachers. They've done that for a number of years, and they've focused on bringing a cultural perspective to that. There are tons of companies out there that do these J1 visa type of things, but they're not necessarily aligning it with an intercultural experience or the benefits of intercultural development with a school. So that's been one way people have come. And the other thing I'm thinking about too is we have another keynote tomorrow at noon. Jesse Wise of Geo does teacher travel, and he does not do student travel. So I don't know how this would work, but for credit, teachers can travel abroad to several countries, and he does like 60 or 70 trips a year, and we're actually going to do a trip with him, but that's another surprise for tomorrow. I don't know if he would do student trips or not, but there are companies that do specialize in student travel. But again, the funding of all this is always the issue. Anything else that you can think of, Bonnie, that might be helpful?
Yeah, not particularly in terms of fundraising. As I said, if anybody has, thanks for that. If anybody has anything they want to add to the chat, that would be great. Lucy, I would like to see if we can take your question about organizations self-assessing and planning strategically.
Yeah.
Before we have to wrap up, if you could put that one up.
Yeah, let me do that. It's my own question and I didn't star it. Sorry. But my question was, how do you assess for how your organization is doing? And I have no idea where I put that question.
That's okay. I could just read it from here, but I did want to address that one, the question about how you can assess your organizations and plan strategically. It was under 334, if that helps.
That does help. Thank you.
So okay. I did want to comment on that. And thank you. I did want to comment on that.
There we go.
In terms of self-assessing and planning strategically, because it is something that organizations don't do as often as they should, or groups don't do as often as they should. And so there's some templates out there that you can look at in terms of self-assessments for boards. And again, if anybody's interested in this, I'd be happy to share them. But it really is customization. It's the global mindset, and it's the commitment. It's being a learning organization. So it's the organization deciding that they want to self-assess and coming up with a way of doing it that will work for them. And often organizations get into this pattern where they talk the right talk. They maybe have global or international in their name. They may have a particular part of their strategy that has global and international in it, but they really don't get into what that means. And the key is to really sort of delve deeply, and to really think about what that means to you. And that's part of the key questions I talked about initially, that once you, and then often if organizations do that, and then they do self-assess, as we know, and it's true of any kind of group, we all get busy, with our day-to-day, and that's a like to do as opposed to a must do. So there needs to be a practice. There needs to be a way you continue it. So it may be champions, it may be these key questions. I had one organization that came up with these key questions that they wanted to focus on at the beginning of every meeting. Until they got into that pattern. And so it's not so much planning strategically in some ways, it's thinking strategically, and recognizing it's a practice, and especially with international engagement, how it's a practice.
So when you, out of curiosity, when you engage with an organization, well, first of all, do you recommend organizations having some sort of facilitator that kind of guides them? And what are the benefits of that? And what does it look like when you facilitate with an organization, out of curiosity?
Thanks, Lucy. So whether or not it's helpful to have a facilitator, again, really depends on the organization. If these can be uncomfortable conversations, and sometimes it can be hard for people that get it, especially if they're the staff people working with leadership, volunteer leadership, or board members, it can be a very hard conversation to move ahead. So if it's an uncomfortable conversation, or if the leadership wants to sit back and listen and participate, and not have to facilitate the conversation, then there can certainly be value added. So when I work with an organization, the first question and conversation that I have with whoever's thinking about bringing somebody on is, what's the value added? And that, are there things that I could bring to the process that you don't necessarily, it's challenging for you to do yourself. It may be facilitating meetings. It may be facilitating a process. It may be talking with, interviewing various members of their leadership to get their perceptions, and to then collate that information so that it comes back in a way that people don't have to get defensive about how they're feeling. So there can be lots of different steps to the process, but it's got to be very customized to the organization. And having been an executive director myself, I feel it's really important that when I come in, I'm a partner to the organization, and help to facilitate the process, but that the process is the organization's, because otherwise, whenever the external person goes out, it's not sustainable and it's not going to continue. So that's a lot of my approach. And it's a lot of that core and customization that I was talking about, that there's some things that are core to good interventions, good facilitation, good consultation, but a lot of that is about customization and being a partner.
I think if you don't customize, then you don't get buy-in. That's the bottom line. And and that's what you need. You need everybody on board and excited about moving in a certain direction.
Yeah.
I agree. That's awesome. So this has been a lot of useful information. Bonnie has been active in the conference, and you can reach her through the People tab under our event tab on the right-hand chat. We also put up her information. I'll put up her website one more time too, so that you have it. Feel free to engage Bonnie in a conversation about your organization, or going global in general. And, we're so excited to have her here, and the recording will be up shortly, so that you can review it for all the gems that were part of this. And please, thank you everyone for coming. Bonnie, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. We deeply appreciate it. It's great to see you here. And the last thing I'll say is, the next hour is our expo. And so please drop into the booths from our partners. They will be there live, I think. Most of them will be there, and they're eager to connect with you. Even if you just want to say, hi, what's this about? How can I learn more? How can I partner with you? That sort of thing. We would love for you to go visit them. And then we'll start up again with more sessions after next hour. But this hour is a dedicated hour to kind of visit with our supporters and learn more about their work. So thanks everyone for coming. We really appreciate it. And we will see you next hour.
Thanks, Lucy, and thanks, everyone. I appreciate your engagement.